All right, well, hello everyone. Welcome to our Meet the Expert event. I'm Clint Osman with the Buena Vista Museum, and today we're going to be here with Dr. Robert Yohe. Today he will be speaking to us a little about mummification in ancient Egypt, and he will discuss his research in Egypt where human mummies ranging in age from over 3,000 years to over 1,500 years old have been recovered. Dr. Yohe received his bachelor's degree in anthropology from California State University, San Bernardino, and his master's degree and PhD in anthropology at the University of California, Riverside. Dr. Yohe is currently professor and program director of anthropology and director of the Laboratory of Archaeological Sciences at California State University, Bakersfield, and associate director of the Egyptian Tell El-Hibeh Archaeological Project with UC Berkeley. Now, I actually had the pleasure of being a student of Dr. Yohe's at Cal State, so I know that you are all in for a real treat tonight. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and welcome Dr. Yohe. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Clint, and good evening, everybody. This is going to be hopefully fun for everyone. Everyone seems to enjoy mummies. I apologize for my terrible camera, but you're more interested in watching the slides than watching me, so that shouldn't be a problem. But as Clint says, I've had the good fortune of being able to work in Egypt starting in 2003, and the last time I was able to visit was in 2017. And one of my jobs working at the site of Tell El-Hibeh is I'm the specialist in studying the human remains, and that includes the mummies as well as any human skeletal material that we happen to recover. So I would like to start off by defining mummification and talking about the differences that exist between natural mummies and those that are made intentionally. And it turns out that when there are certain environmental conditions, such as extreme aridity, or it's extremely cold, or sometimes it's a combination of extreme aridity and coldness together, that leads to natural preservation. So it's not always the case that we see as archaeologists mummies that are intentionally mummified, but those that are the result of just natural desiccation. And probably one of the best examples of one of the recent discoveries in the last couple of years have been a number of these child ice mummies from the Andes in Peru. And what is amazing about these particular natural mummies is that these young children were, well, some of them were in their teens. The individual that's in this slide was a teenage girl. They were taken up into the higher elevations of the Andes and sacrificed to some god or another, and left there as tribute. And 500 years later, archaeologists come along and they find these perfectly preserved bodies. And you can see not only is the tissue well preserved, but everything that this young lady was wearing was well preserved also. Another type of mummy is the ice mummy, or as I said, sometimes you get a combination of extremely arid conditions as well as freezing temperatures that cause the body to not only dry out, but essentially freeze dry. So one of the most famous ice mummies is Ötzi, the Iceman, who was initially discovered accidentally by skiers in the Italian Alps near the Austrian border back in 1991. And as it turns out, Ötzi, the Iceman, is the oldest human mummy that exists. It's older than any Egyptian mummy. And it's 5,300 years old. And scientists have had the opportunity over the past several decades now to study and restudy Ötzi. And every time that they study Ötzi, they find something new. And one of the things that they discovered most recently is that he was murdered. That wasn't something that was apparent initially when they did the initial autopsy on the body. We see a couple of scientists here going over Ötzi's remains, and he really was complete enough to where they were able to do a full autopsy and look at the contents of his stomach as well as his intestines. So they were able to verify several separate meals that this individual had some 5,300 years ago. So really quite remarkable. But in addition to his body, a lot of his clothing and his implements were preserved as well. He had a cape that he was wearing. It was a woven cape. He had animal skins. He had pants. He had boots that were stuffed with grass. He had a bow. He had a copper axe. This was still during the Copper Age. This is before bronze was even invented. And it turns out that it seems that Ötzi met an unpleasant demise with an arrow in the back. A more recent autopsy and some medical imaging found an arrow point lodged under one of his shoulder blades. And in previous medical imaging events, they had missed that entirely. So, and some additional DNA studies that have been done suggest that there might have been as many as 5 different individuals involved in some type of altercation. There was some sort of battle, but it ended poorly for Ötzi, and he died high in the Andes, or excuse me, high in the Alps, and became freeze-dried. Another type of mummy that, or preserved human remains at least, that most people have heard of are the bog people. And these are really unusual in that they occur in places we wouldn't expect to find preserved human remains. Because so far I've indicated that if it's really dry, or it's really cold, or it's really cold and dry, those are great circumstances to get preservation of soft tissue. But with the bog people, you don't have any of those things other than it's cold and damp, and there's a lot of peat bogs, a type of moss that grows and covers the surface of many areas in Northern Europe and in the British Isles. And peat has a lot of uses, both for fuel and for insulating houses, the roofs of houses at least. So people have been mining peat for many thousands of years, actually. And in the process of mining this peat, or in these peat bogs, they've encountered human remains. And sometimes those human remains are really well preserved, and we wouldn't expect them to be because it's a wet environment. But what makes this wet environment so special is that it has a certain chemistry that actually tans the skin of the bodies, which is great if we're talking about, the skin of the body. It's not so great for the internal organs or any of the other soft tissues. It seems that the tannins, the tannic acid in peat bogs, is what preserves the skin and the hair on these bog mummies, if you will. And in this particular photograph, we see where peat has been mined. People have been cutting it out, and this is really damp soil with this moss that lives in it. It keeps the soil moist. And this is a body that was found during the process of mining this peat out. And so the type of preservation we get with these bog bodies, and by recent accounting, it seems that there is less than 130 bog bodies that have been discovered. And some of them have been really well preserved, others not so much. And you can see a couple examples here. They seem to be mostly skulls and bones with some good hair. Or we do get to see, in the case of the individual in the lower center picture, combination of the hair and the soft tissues of the face are pretty well preserved. But overall, none of the internal organs are preserved. You don't get this type of quality of preservation that we saw in either the Andean mummies or Utsi the Iceman. But that still doesn't mean that we can't get important information about these ancient people. And most of these bog people died between 4,000 and 2,000 years ago. There's one exception to that, and that's nearly 8,000-year-old bog person, but the preservation of that particular individual is not all that great. So those are natural mummies, and there are other examples from around the world, but that's enough to give you kind of a number of good examples of natural mummification, particularly of interest to archaeologists. Well, what about purposeful mummies? Well, it turns out that one of the most well-known intentional mummies are those that come from Egypt. And most everyone has heard of King Tut's mummy and the mummies that are of members of the royal family from the Valley of the Kings that are on display at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. That's a very different type of mummy than the natural mummies that we've been talking about. But interestingly enough, the ancient Egyptians learned from watching what happened to bodies that were buried in the desert sands near the Nile that have a lot of natural salts in them. And these salts are called natron, and they're from ancient lakes and oceans. These salty deposits, one of their major components is the chemical sodium carbonate. And it just so happens that sodium carbonate is particularly good at removing moisture from soft tissue. And if you look at the photograph of the burial on the right, that is a pre-dynastic Egyptian burial. But you'll notice that the body looks pretty well preserved. The skin is still in place, and that's where the Egyptians got the idea that if they took the salt, the natron, and they packed bodies in it, that the bodies would be preserved. But that brings the next question, which is why did the ancient Egyptians even care? I mean, why did they want their dead to be preserved? And that's a really important question, because it turns out that one of the most important aspects in the life of ancient Egyptians was to be able to have certainty that they would make it into the afterlife. And the only way that they could be assured that they would make it into the afterlife is if they had a mummy. And so, but there are a couple of other things that they needed as well. They had to have a mummy, and as we'll see, they had to have their name written down somewhere, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But the mummy was most important, and it was critical that the mummy look as closely as possible as the living person. And you may say, why is that important? Well, in a moment, I'll address that issue. But what it all comes to is that the Egyptian afterlife is referred to as the land of two fields. And that's kind of the equivalent of the Judeo-Christian heaven, if you will. And the ancient Egyptians believed that if they followed the proper etiquette that was necessary to make it into the afterlife, then they would live forever with the god of the dead, Osiris, in the land of two fields. So that's the goal. But how do you make that? How do you get to the two fields? Well, first of all, you have to understand a little bit about how the Egyptians viewed the nature of the soul. It's much more complicated than the Judeo-Christian view of the soul, in that it's not a single entity, but it's several different components. Depending on how you evaluate it, it could be 4 or 5 different components. But two of the most important aspects of the soul were known as the Ba and the Ka. And in the photograph on the right of the slide, we have an image taken from an ancient Egyptian papyrus document that shows the Ba aspect of the soul finding its mummy. And what it comes down to is that all aspects of your soul, whether it be the Ba or the Ka or any of the other components, including one that's basically a ghost, they need to be able to recognize the body. They need to be able to see and say, oh, yeah, I recognize me. And so one has to do 3 things in order to get into the afterlife. They have to have a good mummy. They have to have their name written down, either on papyrus or in stone or on wood. It needs just to be written down somewhere. More places, better. And then, most importantly, they had to make it through the hall of judgment without being devoured by the demon Ammit. And that wasn't necessarily as easy as it might have sounded. In fact, a lot of the items that were included in the tomb with the mummy were some items to help the soul make it through the afterlife. And so this is the Hall of Judgment as viewed by the ancient Egyptians. And there are some important Egyptian gods that we need to be introduced to here. And one of those is the god Anubis, who's responsible for guiding the dead through the Hall of Judgment and basically making sure that they get on that riverboat that will take them to the two fields. But the only way that they can make that journey is if they pass judgment. And it's very interesting. The ancient Egyptians believed that the heart was the seat of the soul. So that, you know, and of course, many other cultures view the heart as being very important in terms of emotions. Well, the ancient Egyptians took it quite literally that the heart was where the soul was. And it was the only organ that was left in the body during the process of mummification. In fact, some organs that you might consider as being important when viewing, you know, someone's life, like the brain, were just considered an inconvenience to the Egyptian embalmers, as we'll see here in a few moments. The heart was left in the body, and one of the reasons was so that the heart could be weighed in the Hall of Judgment. And if we take a look at this scale here, we'll see that there's this funny little character with what looks like a feather sticking out at the top of her head. And it is a her, it's the goddess Ma'at. And Ma'at represents balance and righteousness. And if your heart weighs the same as the feather of Ma'at, then you've passed a major milestone. If it doesn't, then there's this horrific demon named Ammit, who we see here off to the right, who has the head of a crocodile and the mane of a lion, actually the forebody of a lion, and the back end of it is hippopotamus. So it's a chimera of crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus mixed together in a very vile way. And if Ammit devours your heart, then that's it. You are destined to oblivion. So we see Anubis both guiding the dead into the place where the judgment is occurring, but we also see him being responsible for helping Ma'at work the scales. And over to the right here, we see the god Tot writing it all down. Tot is the god of knowledge and of scribes and of science and mathematics and all things intellectual. So it's interesting that you see these various deities all being part of this process just to get through to the next stage, which is, there is one more feat that has to be dealt with, but it's trivial by comparison. But if they make it through this part of the Hall of Judgment, then they're assured a place on the bark, and a bark is a type of Egyptian ship that will take them to the two fields. So again, the gods, Anubis, we see an image of Anubis. Anubis shows up frequently in tomb imagery, as statues. It's kind of hard not to look around anywhere in ancient Egypt and not see an image of this important deity. And Ma'at was also important And of course, Osiris was the god of the afterlife. Even though people recognize Anubis as being the god associated with death, Anubis is more like the guide for the soul and the protector of the dead. Whereas Osiris will be their eternal guardian in the two fields. You go, when you die, you go, if everything goes well, you're going to go hang out with Osiris for eternity. And of course, Tot is the god, an ibis-headed god. We'll go back for a moment. You'll notice he has a funny little beak. And in fact, a lot of Egyptian gods and goddesses are represented by animals. And they'll either be represented by the full animal form or a human with the animal head. Like Anubis, the god in its animal form is a jackal. But in this instance, we see Anubis walking as a man with the head of a jackal. So one of the things that's interesting about Egyptian theology is that the gods can take several different forms. In fact, the god Tot can show up as a baboon. So in some instances, if we see an image of a baboon, we have to be sure the context before we understand whether it's just a baboon or it's supposed to represent Tot or some other deity. So how do you make a mummy? How was it done? And as amazing as it may seem, for a long time, archaeologists weren't 100% sure. And it's only been in the last 75 years or so that combination of archaeological research, scouring of historic accounts, in addition to forensic analyses, and that's been most useful, it's been allowing us to be able to reconstruct how mummies were made. And it turns out that during various periods of Egyptian history, it was a big business. It was bigger than the funeral business is today in modern America. Everybody had to have a mummy, and so there were, industrial shops in ancient Egypt that were designed to create all these mummies, but there was also an important religious aspect to it. So it wasn't just a bunch of craftsmen, it was a combination of specialists and those people that had the religious training to be able to read the special spells and wear the appropriate masks and religious equipment. We can see here the image on the right that there's a table in the shape of a lion with a mummy on it, and there's Anubis with a container, and Anubis is just finished with the process of mummification here. And you'll notice that below this table, there are these 4 jars, and they each have a funny little animal head on them, except for this one. This one has a human head, this one has a jackal head, and this one has a baboon head, and this one has the head of a falcon. And we're going to find out that these are the canopic jars that the organs were placed in. The organs were removed from the body, mummified separately, and put in these jars. So, as you might imagine, a purposeful mummy was a big undertaking, and it required many steps. And the most important initial step was to get all the organs out of the body as quickly as possible that would start decomposing right away. And of course, the stomach and the intestinal tract are, they're full of bacteria to begin with. And those bacteria, once you die, they no longer have, they're no longer kept in check. And so the decomposition process starts within hours. And we have to remember, especially in most of the year in Egypt, it's very warm. And so that temperature, that higher temperature, makes the process of decomposition take place more rapidly. So it's really important to try to get as much of the material out of the body that would cause it to start to decay. And the first important organ to remove, in addition to the viscera in the abdominal cavity and thorax, happens to be the brain. Well, how do you get the brain out? Well, the Egyptian came up with a pretty nifty solution. That is to take a metal rod, initially copper, but in later times bronze, and then stick it into the sinuses. And it turns out that the bone at the back of the sinuses is pretty thin, so it breaks easily. So they would take this rod, stick it up the nose, and break the bone at the back of the sinuses into the skull cavity, to where they could scramble up the brain, quite literally, and then they would turn the head over and shake it vigorously to make sure that the brains drained out the nostrils. Now that sounds really horrific, but it was considered to be of utmost importance in terms of mummification, is to get the brain out, because the brain is 70% water and it starts decomposing very rapidly. So the brain goes out, but so do the internal organs. The internal organs are removed from an incision in the side, and they're mummified separately. And as we'll see, when we get back to the canopic jars, each one of those canopic jars is important for a certain set of organs. And remember, the only organ that they leave in the body is the heart. So what we're seeing in this reconstruction here is a priest wearing an Anubis mask and his assistant taking the body. Now, at this point, the body has all the organs removed except for the heart. It has been washed in very strong palm wine, which has a high alcohol content, so that's going to kill all the surface bacteria. But the insides of the body have also been cleaned out with this palm wine. And then in many cases, the pieces of gauze were mixed in with natron, and then those were stuffed into the body cavity to help dry out the inside of the body. And on the outside, they would take it and put it in a bed of natron. So all of this, what looks like sand here, is actually the natron salt, which desiccates the body fairly rapidly. But you have to consider there's a lot of water in human muscle. So it would take anywhere from 70 to 120 days for the body to completely desiccate, putting it in this natron salt. And you'll notice that this special container they have the body in, there's a a little spout here at the end. Well, what happens to the water that's drawn out of the body? Well, it tends to drain out. And so this bed is on an incline, so the fluids from the body can drain out into a container that can then be dumped elsewhere. So it requires a great deal of attention. You know, every couple of times a day, the priests are going to have to come over and make sure that the body's covered with all the salt that it needs to be, and that the fluids that are drained out have been dumped. So once the body is desiccated, once it's completely dried out, and speaking from experience, if you want to know what mummy tissue is like, just think of jerky. Beef jerky, turkey jerky, doesn't matter. Jerky is essentially what mummy tissue is. It's muscle tissue that is completely desiccated. And it, not to be too gross about it, but mummy tissue looks just like jerky. It does, and for good reason, because muscle tissue is muscle tissue, whether it's, you know, beef or human. And once it gets dried out, it tends to be the same color and looks pretty much the same. Well, the next important phase is, of course, to cover the body. You need to fill the cranium with resin to help preserve it, and cover the body, the outside of the body, with resin. And a lot of these resins are a combination of frankincense and myrrh that have antimicrobial properties. So by making a paste of this resin and rubbing it over the body, that helps keep the dry tissue from decomposing, even though it's less apt to decompose now that it's been had all the water removed from it. So we see a mummy being wrapped here initially, and there appear to be some objects, and those are amulets. It was important to protect the mummy from all sorts of possible attacks by evil entities and such. So they put within the wrappings various amulets. And it's because of this practice that everybody who knows anything about mummies understands in ancient Egypt that a lot of looters who come to destroy archaeological sites so they can get things to sell on the black market, they tear mummies apart to get to these amulets, which is one of the biggest problems that I've faced working at Tell El-Hibeh, is that mummies, intact mummies, don't stay intact very long if looters are around, and that's the reason. Originally, those amulets were there to protect, but unfortunately, in the modern world, it has the opposite effect. So the last stage is, of course, and you'll see in this reconstruction, we have a priest wearing a mask of Anubis, as well as some priests reading from the Book of the Dead, special spells that are supposed to assist the mummy in its journey into the afterlife and to help protect it. So back to those canopic jars. That turns out that another important god in the Egyptian pantheon is the god Horus, the falcon-headed god. And Horus had 4 sons, and those 4 sons are represented with the lids to each of these canopic jars. And one of those is the baboon-headed son of Horus named Hapi. And then there's the falcon-headed god, who is Keba and then the human-headed deity is Imseti, and then the jackal-headed son of Horus named Duamateth. So Happy is responsible for the lungs. So the lungs are desiccated and put inside of the jar. And the same with the intestines and the liver and the stomach. They were all considered to be important for the mummy in the afterlife. So they were mummified and put in these protective jars. And the four sons of Horus are recognized in funerary scrolls and on funerary objects to be protectors of the dead. So they're protecting organs, and when their images are put on coffins, they're protecting the dead. So when it's all said and done, the mummy is then wrapped in anywhere from 10 or 15 yards of linen to up to several hundred yards of linen. And I'll show you an example here of a mummy that is definitely overkill when it comes to the linen. This is a Roman aged mummy, and we'll see that the initial wrapping was to keep some of the amulets in place, and to each of the fingers were individually wrapped, and the toes. Everything was in these bandages too, were sometimes soaked in resin to help the gauze that was touching the skin. The first layer sometimes had resin on it to help preserve the skin, or excuse me, preserve the tissue. And then you'll see here in the second image that was wrapped with several, we're probably talking about close to, 40 or 50 yards of material total going into this. And then the final wrapping, and we've got images of the god Osiris on here, the god of the afterlife. And then once the mummy is completely wrapped, it is put in a sarcophagus. And the type of sarcophagus that you're put into varied over Egyptian history. But it was typical to have the image of a face. Sometimes it was as close as they could get to the face of the individual represented in the coffin. Sometimes it was a generic face. It kind of depended on how much you were willing to pay for having your sarcophagus made. Here's some examples of some sarcophagi that were recently found at Saqqara in Egypt. Just within the last year, they found 60 new mummies that were in these beautifully preserved wooden coffins. Now, the wood that these coffins are made from, I interchange the words coffin and sarcophagus. Sarcophagus means quite literally body eating, but it's really meant to mean the house of the body. So sarcophagus is one term that we use, and sarcophagi can be either wood or they can be stone, and sometimes there are multiple coffins, as we'll see. But these coffins were typically made out of cedar because cedar helped preserve the mummy, and cedar had to be imported from the Levant, northeast of Egypt, because there wasn't any cedar to be found in Egypt, only palm trees. So you can see here the sarcophagus, the mummy, and you'll see that there's all kinds of imagery, and a lot of this imagery is meant to protect the mummy, as well as there's hieroglyphic text that is frequently sections from the Egyptian Book of the Dead to further protect the mummy. Now, the pharaohs, of course, got better treatment. And so in the case of King Tut, for example, not only does he have this tremendous mummy mask that goes over his mummy's face, but he has 3 coffins, and they're all covered with gold and jewels and lapis lazuli and other beautiful semi-precious stones. So the pharaohs had the fanciest coffins, but the average folks, and the fanciest tombs. This is Tut's tomb, give you an idea, and Tut's resting place. But a lot of regular folks got put in far less glamorous tombs or far less glamorous coffins. In this case, roughly hewn limestone coffins. And in this tomb that I excavated at Tell El-Hibeh in 2006, actually we did a salvage project there, myself and a couple of graduate students. You can see it's not terribly large, and all of these sarcophagi are stone sarcophagi. And unfortunately, they were looted by the time we got there. But it's a pretty basic tomb that was cut right into the limestone, and it was used over a 2,000-year period. So it was initially used 3,000 years ago, but it was used subsequent to that for other purposes, for other burials. We found coffins in here that were wooden that represent later time periods. But it wasn't just humans that were mummified. Animals were mummified too. Crocodiles, hawks, cats. And we have to remember that crocodiles, hawks, and cats all represented certain Egyptian deities. In the case of the cat, the god Bast or Bastet was a very important god to the ancient Egyptians and was represented by the domestic cat. And you'll see these are some very fancy cat mummies from the Roman period. And this is a mummy of a baboon. So just about any animal you can imagine, any animal that represented a god is going to have mummies. And the Egyptians mummified all sorts of things. If it lived, it probably got mummified. I've even seen Nile perch mummies. Yep, Nile perch mummies, that's true. So it was important to get the mummies to look as good as possible. And we can see that the embalmers did a pretty good job with some of the royal mummies, such as this is one of the mummies of Ramses, one of the Ramses, and some more of the royal mummies, some preserved a little better than others. And we can see that the preservation on this particular mummy of Ramses the second, I believe, not bad, not bad. And of course, this has been useful to us when it comes to trying to do reconstructions of what these famous people look like. You can see here that we've got Queen Tai, who was the grandmother of King Tut. And between the imagery that we have and her mummy and forensic methods, we're able to do a fairly accurate reconstruction of what she looked like when she was living. So a little bit about my work with mummies. Tell El-Hibeh is about 120, 130 miles south of Cairo. It's in Middle Egypt. There's a picture of me on that, working in that tomb I just showed you a picture of a few minutes ago. But I've also worked on mummies from collections, and the one I worked with most recently was in 2009, and it was part of a collection that we had as an exhibit at Cal State Bakersfield from the Hearst Museum at UC Berkeley. They have a fabulous collection of Egyptian antiquities. We got permission to borrow some of those, and we had a huge exhibit in 2009. And one of the items that came in that exhibit was a mummy, but it was a mysterious mummy because it wasn't sure if it was a woman or a man, and it's possible that it was associated with a coffin of a female named Iwis and Min, or it could have been someone that may have been her husband, who's represented by a coffin that's at the British Museum, named Nesmin. And then there was also the name in the catalog of Intawi. So we couldn't be sure who this was until we did some kind of medical imaging. And fortunately, Quest Imaging on Stockdale offered to give us that opportunity. And this is the coffin that the mummy was associated with, but there is also a coffin at the British Museum that came from the same cemetery in the same time period. So the question began, well, was the mummy from the right coffin? And what does this Intawi, where does that come into play? So this is part of the exhibit, and this was the mummy that we had on display. And when we started to take the exhibit down for it to be recreated and shipped back to Berkeley, we got the opportunity to do the CT scan. And the CT scan gave us a great deal of information almost immediately. So within moments, I was able to determine that it was a, middle-aged female. And that solved the mystery. It's Iwis and Min. It's not Intawi. It's not Nesmin. It is Iwis and Min. And turns out that she had osteoporosis. Some of her wisdom teeth didn't come all the way in. She had some arthritic changes to her spine. But most interestingly, there was evidence. See that area there? There should be some bone, and there's no bone. So that's evidence, direct evidence that they removed the brain through the nostrils, which is called a transnasal craniotomy, by the way. That's the word for the day, transnasal craniotomy. And you can see that shriveled up thing in the chest there, that's the heart. And these other things are packets. Rather than canopic jars, in the case of Iwis and Min, her organs were mummified separately and then put back into her body before she was wrapped. And so we can see an image in a cross section here of those those mummified organ packets. And we can also, when we take a look at her whole body image, this is either a wood or a cartonnage plug that was used to cover the incision that was used initially to take the organs out, but was also used later to put the organs back in. And Iwis and Min got to be displayed one more time at the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology back in 2010. And I was able to contribute the information we got from the CT scan to that exhibit. So the work with mummies at El-Hibeh, I've worked with several different types of mummies, but the most interesting are the mummies from a Christian cemetery that dates from about AD 350 to around AD 500. And this large cemetery, it seems, I estimated that based on what we've found so far, that there were probably anywhere from 300 to 500 people buried there. And we just scratched the surface in the work that we started in 2003. So just a little bit about Hibeh. As I said, it's about 130 miles south of Cairo. It's where the big red star is, on just right on the Nile, just on the eastern bank of the Nile. And satellite image of it looks like a big old wedge of pizza there. That crust portion is the north wall, and it's a big town site. That town site was established by the pharaoh Shoshank I about 3,000 years ago, during what we call the beginning of the third intermediate period in Egyptian chronology. So the site is on the Nile. It's gigantic. It's, you know, more than a quarter mile in length, and it has more than an eighth of a mile wide. It's mud brick. It has this gigantic mud brick wall that was part of the fortification. Another thing that makes Hibeh, which in ancient times it was known as Tjoy, the ancient city of Tjoy. And Tjoy was the northernmost outpost for Upper Egypt. And as confusing as it may seem, Upper Egypt is the southern part of Egypt, and Lower Egypt is basically the area around Saqqara, north of Saqqara to the Mediterranean, including the Delta, is Lower Egypt. So in this site is surrounded by these mud brick walls, and those mud brick walls are stamped, and that turns out to be important because it gives us information about who was in charge at the time when that part of the wall was built, because that is the name of a high priest of Amun in Thebes. And we have a temple that was dedicated to the god Amun. And the pharaoh Shoshank I, who not only is one of the few pharaohs to be mentioned in the Christian Bible, but he's also the first non-Egyptian pharaoh. He was from Libya. So in 2003, I noticed that in a huge looter pit, there were mummies eroding out, and that we needed to do something about that as soon as possible. So when we returned in 2004, we made a concerted effort to excavate this area and remove these mummies. And one of the interesting things that you might not think about is that mummies smell horrible. They really have a bad odor. And that's a result, of course. I mean, they're decomposed. Because of the resin component, they smell like a combination of roadkill and incense. So if you can wrap your mind around that. And the reason that we're wearing respirators was for health reasons, because when you're working with these ancient human remains, there is a condition known as mummy lung that you can get. So we tried to remain as safe as possible when we were excavating these bodies. And what's interesting about them is we found they were incredibly heavy, and they shouldn't have been heavy. They should have been very light, because mummies are light. The linen is kind of heavy, to be sure. So in 2005, we got permission to open one of the mummies up. And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm making the initial incision in the wrapping. And what we discovered is that these bodies were packed in natron. Now, prior 100 years prior to this, it was still okay for mummification. But during Christian times, during the time when Rome was in control of Egypt, in the 4th century AD, a lot of things happened. It went from being a pagan Roman Empire to being a Christian Roman Empire. And so Egypt being part of the empire, it went from being pagan to becoming Christian. So one of the ways that the locals dealt with that rapid change was burying the bodies as quickly as possible, but packing them in natron so that they would mummify in the ground. And when we found them, you can see that the tissue, at least on the right side of the body, is really well preserved. See, eyeball is preserved there, and the musculature of the neck, some of the hair. And it turns out that the hair is very consistent with mummy portraits from this same time period, a little earlier, maybe 100 years earlier, but it was consistent. Now, one last thing that made this particular mummy, and he had the name of Arsani, which was given to him by television crew. There was a program called The Bone Detectives, and in 2007, they filmed an episode here based on my work on this particular mummy. He had a blow to the back of his head. You can see a big depressed fracture. And it turns out that the likely cause of that fracture, and that killed him. That would have, there's no evidence of healing. He was seriously damaged. Roman sling bullet. So he was running from a battle because he got hit in the back of the head. But these are the types of slings that were used by the ancient Romans. And these preserved slings are from a tomb context in Egypt. But one of the important artillery groups of the ancient Roman armies were those who manned the slings. And we can see here a bunch of, a group of sling infantry. And those sling bullets would fly at a great velocity, and the lead sling bullets look like little footballs. And so they would fly through the air very aerodynamically and would cause the type of injury that we saw the back of our Arsani's skull. So I went a little bit over. There's a lot more to talk about, but are there any questions?
I guess at this time, I'd like to invite you guys to go ahead and, if you have any questions, just go ahead and type it into the chat there. I guess while I wait for that, I have a question about how long did the entire process of mummification take?
Usually anywhere from 120 to 150 days. And what took the longest, of course, was the desiccation of the body. Once that part, I mean, the initial removal of the organs and the brain and preparing the body for being put into the natron, that didn't take very long. You could probably do that in a day, but the body needed to be continually turned and have fresh natron put on it and make sure that it wasn't sitting in any fluids that was draining out of it, because it was important to keep that body as dry as possible. And once it got dry, then it would probably take a few days to put the resin on the body and then wrap it and then prepare it for interment within sarcophagus. So yeah, anywhere, basically a 3 or 4 month process.
All right, thank you. It looks like Gina has a question. Do people still get mummified today?
Interestingly enough, there have been a few people who requested experimentally to, after they die, to be mummified in a traditional Egyptian way. And those few individuals, the ones that I'm aware of, were allowed, they got special permission to have their bodies treated in that way. And it's not terribly common, though. There've just been a few instances, and the one individual did it just so there could be documentation to see how the whole process, how long it took, and some of the things that we've assumed, this was an experimental way to demonstrate whether our assumptions were correct or not. And for the most part, yeah, we had done a pretty good job of figuring out how it was done. So yeah, there have been some, probably within the last 20 years, a small number of people that have had their bodies embalmed in the traditional ancient Egyptian manner, but it's not commonplace, and it's terribly expensive, I might add.
All right, next question comes from Luke. He's age 8. He says, how many animal gods did the Egyptians have?
Oh my gosh. That question, I would say it could be as many as 200 or more. The ones that were, and the reason I say that is that Egypt was divided into 42 similar to our states, and each one of those states, and they called them nomes, and each one of those nomes had its own special animal god that was different from the normal pantheon of animal gods. But the major animal gods are, of course, Anubis, Horus, Sobek, who is the crocodile-headed god, Tot, who is the ibis-headed god, the scribe god. Of course, Anubis is the jackal-headed god. There were, oh yeah, the animal form of the god Amun was a ram. And the list goes on. So in addition to those 42 states or nomes that had their own special animal gods, there was the pantheon of general Egyptian gods, which about 15 of those were animal gods. And in fact, one of the things that the Romans found most distasteful about Egyptian religion initially was the fact that they were horrified that they worshiped animals, because Greek and Roman gods were all anthropomorphic. They all looked like humans. And it was the Egyptians who were the odd ones, who had gods that were all these, there was even Serket, who was the goddess, the scorpion goddess. So, I mean, ooh, who wants a bug goddess or an arachnid goddess? So the Egyptians were unique in that regard. And so without spending the next hour further explaining this, yes, there were hundreds of animal deities in the Egyptian pantheon.
All right, thank you. The next question is from Julian. How long would it take for a frog to be mummified?
Oh, that's a cool question. And that one's pretty easy to answer because I've actually done that. It only takes about a month to mummify a frog. Of course, it depends on how big the frog is. And to be correct, I didn't do a frog, it was a toad. And the toad, and I packed it in, I didn't pack it in natron, I packed it in regular table salt just to see how long it would take. And yeah, it took about 30 days during the summertime. And the other thing was that I kept it outside in a jar in the salt, and then I check it every few days. So yeah, the smaller something is, the faster it is to mummify. And following up on that whole thing about salt, there have been human bodies found in ancient salt mines where there have been collapses, and those bodies have actually preserved very well. So sodium chloride table salt can also be used to preserve bodies, as well as sodium carbonate.
All right, I don't see any more questions in the chat, but if you're having trouble typing it in, I'm going to go ahead and open it up. If you want to go ahead and unmute your microphone, if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
I have the same question of the frog, except with the cow this time.
Oh, you say a cow?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Interesting you should mention that, because there are mummies of ancient oxen, and I'm not aware of any scientific replicative studies where they've tried to do an oxen, but just based on the sheer body volume of an ox or a cow, it would probably take several months. I would say several months. But yes, indeed, there are one of the important Egyptian deities was the Apis bull, and there are mummies of Apis bulls that were intentionally treated the same way as humans, only, you know, their organs were removed and they were pretty much processed in the same way, but their body mass is so much greater that I would imagine it would have taken several months.
All right, are there any more questions? All right, well, oh, wait, here's one here. Did other cultures make mummies?
Oh, yeah.
Besides Egypt.
Yeah, there are other instances around the world where mummies were made in different ways. The Moche in Peru prepared bodies specifically for mummification. There are certain peoples in Papua New Guinea who actually they smoke their ancestors. I mean, they put them in a smokehouse, and you know, like we smoke hams and ribs and such, they take humans and smoke them. So it both dries the body out, and the smoke actually helps preserve it, just like the smoke helps preserve hams and anything else that we, you know, smoke. And that was the whole reason we started doing smoking of meats in the first place, was to help preserve it. So, and there are instances all over the world that are similar. In the Northwest coast, they did a similar type of smoking of certain ancestors to make sure that they were preserved. And usually the cultures that do the mummification, no matter what technique they use, it's designed in all but the ancient Egyptians. Most of the others are for ancestor worship, so that you can go and see the bodies of your uncle and grandfather or whomever that you've had mummified through smoking, so you can pay homage to them. But in the case of the ancient Egyptians, of course, it was done so that they could actually live forever. I mean, that was the whole point of mummification for the ancient Egyptians, which makes it kind of unique compared to all the other parts of the world. And one place I didn't mention that has even far more incredible natural mummification is in the Tarim Basin, in kind of the Uzbekistan area. It's cold and it's dry, and there have been bodies over 2,000 or 3,000 years old that have been recovered and perfectly freeze dried. In fact, a few years ago at the what's the name of the museum in Santa Ana? The Bowers Museum. No, that's not it. What is it? Yeah, the Bowers Museum. They had a special exhibit of these Tarim Basin mummies, and I went to see it, and I was just stunned at how incredibly well preserved these bodies were. And it was not intentional, it was natural mummification. So even better than the natural mummification in ancient Egypt.
All right, I think we have time for one more question here. It says, this is from Brittany. Do you have a favorite mummy?
Do I have a favorite? Well, yeah, I actually, I have a favorite mummy at El-Hibeh that, well, Arsani is one of my favorites, but I also have one that it's a mystery mummy. It literally showed up in our mummy storage facility when we were gone one season, and when we came back, it was between 2007 and 2009. When we left in 2007, we had finished my mummy storage facility on site, and the local Ministry of Antiquity representatives had keys. And when we showed up again in 2009, I opened my storage facility and there was this mummy on the floor that I didn't recognize, that appeared to be, I'm pretty sure it's probably a third intermediate period mummy, but I've just been really anxious to do some medical imaging of it so I can figure out who it is, and maybe get some radiocarbon samples to figure out just if it's as old as I think it is. So yeah, I've got some favorite mummies. They're personal people I've met, so.
All right, well, thank you, Dr. Yohe, for your time today.
Thank you.
For sharing, your knowledge with us.
Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to be here, and I appreciate your interest.
Well, the museum would love to have you back again soon.
I'll be here.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Please keep an eye on our website for the next Meet the Expert event. And thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.